All right, the purpose of this video is to talk about my approach to teaching. So people that I've taught over the years, I find that the predominant majority of people that want to learn to play guitar better are people that want to accompany a vocalist. That vocalist might be themselves or it might be somebody else. So you've got people that might have some basic chord knowledge. They might know a C and a minor and a D and a E minor and so on. And they might, play something like... That's fine, and there are times when strumming is completely appropriate, and I've been known to strum songs myself from time to time. But what I've found in my work accompanying a vocalist is when you can apply some finger-picking techniques and some chordal extensions and some interesting chord inversions to the way you accompany a vocalist, be it yourself or somebody else, things can get a lot more interesting. So that song right there, that's the basic chord progression for a song called Serenita Bobenzana. And a number of people out there on YouTube have done it, some of them very nicely, but this is the part that I've come up with for that song just to make it a lot more interesting to perform with my vocal partner. This is the intro. Into the verse. This is my version of the chord progression that I just played earlier. And so on. That's pretty much the chord progression that goes through the whole song. And I found that there are some ways to add some really interesting variations to that, such as this right here. So those are the types of things that if I had a student that came to me and said, okay, well, I got a pretty good grip on some chords here and maybe I can do some finger picking, maybe somebody can do something like... And that's great. It's a nice simple finger picking progression. Some people can do that quite nicely. But there are some ways to take something like that and even make it more interesting. That's actually the beginning chords to the song Imagine by John Lennon, but you might do instead something like... So even just adding something as simple as a higher fifth like that and adding the variation of the major seventh from the root note on the F can make a basic song much more interesting. So here's another one. This is a song by Starling Arrow. It is called Fly Away. And it's just one guitar with a couple of female vocalists singing in harmony. And the basic chord progression is this. And it just goes the same thing through the whole song, basically. Very pretty little basic chord progression, but there's a lot that can be done with that as well. So what I would maybe encourage somebody to do if a student came to me wanting to play that song, I might show them ways to make it more interesting, such as back to the basic chord progression. So those are a few ideas that I would play with a student that came to me, wanting to enhance their guitar skills, accompanying a vocalist. All right, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the whole concept of accompanying a vocalist. So most people, I think, that want to better their skills on guitar, that's their reason for doing it, whether the vocalist is themselves or somebody else. So I've come up with a lot of, I think, really interesting ways of using chords in sort of non-conventional approaches. For one thing, having some classical technique, I think, is really beneficial to somebody who wants to accompany a vocalist. So instead of playing a C chord like that, there's all kinds of ways to make chording much more interesting by having a little bit of classical technique. But what I really wanted to mention is the ability to actually create some gorgeous melodies just using, the most humble of all chords, your C minors, your A minors, your D minors, and so on, or C major rather. So probably one of the first chords people learn is a C major chord. So here's some interesting things that can happen that probably not a lot of students think about in the early stages of their guitar playing. So you've got almost like a full scale here you can play in melodies. Major 7th, root, major 9th, major 3rd on top, flat 5 with the F sharp, 5 with the G. You can even shift up here and go all the way up to your A. So you've actually got a full scale going. So if you introduce hammer-ons and pull-offs to that, you've even got more melodic potentials. So I think this is a really interesting thing for somebody to think about. If they're accompanying a vocalist and the vocalist is taking a break, they can't really launch into a full solo if they're the only guitar player. But what they can do is keep the audience entertained by making their chord structure a lot more interesting with things like... Of course, the same thing can be done with many other chords. With your D minor, you've got some interesting options. And to just play a chord by itself with some finger picking is fine. Oftentimes that's what's called for. But you've got some options here. One thing I really encourage students to do early on is to develop a strong little finger and the ability to do some stretches. So if you have both of those qualities, you can reach up here to the A and do things like... some hammer-ons and pull-offs, you've got a lot of interesting potentials. So, a lot more creativity can be done with just a really basic chord than otherwise just keeping the fingers in position. Then, of course, once you start reaching into other positions, your C minor chord or C major chord we were talking about earlier can be done up here. So you've got some interesting things that can happen there. D minor chord, of course, can be done here. It's a totally fine chord just by itself, but if you take off your bar on the E string, you've basically got a minor 9th that is a really pretty chord, and if you take off your index finger, you've got a minor 9th and a minor with a sus4. You've got basically a little 3-note melody that you can do there just with your index finger. And then, of course, if you do the minor 7th, you've got your little finger free for some other creativity, like... course, you can take your D minor to other areas like this. I don't see people doing this much, but I think this is a really interesting chord. Just a 4-note chord with your minor ninth on the E string, and then of course you've got these other notes like. So you've got all the way from a to a B to a C to a D to a E to a F to a G, and also if you really stretch, you can go all the way to A. Those are, I think, some really interesting things that you can play with as a accompanist to a vocalist. And those are things I would start sharing with somebody fairly early on that was interested in learning guitar for those reasons. Of course, you've got numerous other chords you can do similar things with. A lot of people play the A minor right here, or maybe right here. But an A minor played up here has some interesting potential with melody notes as well. So hopefully those are some things that a student would find productive and interesting. I've had a lot of good feedback teaching those kinds of things to people in the early stages of their journey accompanying a vocalist. All right, this is the final section of this video. No discussion of guitar teaching would probably be complete without talking about a guy who comes in and says, I want to be the next great lead guitarist and I want to play in a band and do great solos. So this is a very important part of guitar playing. If someone's interested in that, of course, in addition to the other things I talked about, the classical and the accompanying a vocalist, finger picking and all of that. So I will say I am very rusty at this type of playing, but there was a time when I was very fluid at it. I can still play some scales. So in regards to teaching somebody who wants to learn about these kind of things, there are a lot of things that I could teach them, even though I may not be completely on top of my game as a fantastic soloist right at the moment. And those can be broken down into some categories. Arpeggios are important, scales are important, and within the subject of scales and arpeggios both, sequences are important. We also have such things as sweep picking, string skipping. One of the first things I would probably tell somebody is hand position is very important. They probably want to keep their fingers as parallel to the frets as possible. There are a lot of people that start playing with the thumb over the top of that. I know there were a lot of guys back in the day, Eric Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan and so on, that played that way and played very well that way, but most of the really accomplished players right now who are fantastic at soloing all basically share the characteristic of playing with the fingers very parallel to the frets and the ball of the thumb and back of the neck. So I would concentrate on that. I would start with teaching some sequences, very simple sequences, and gradually ramp up in complexity. Just a very simple sequence on a C major scale, such as a 3-note sequence. A 4-note sequence. Even a 5-note sequence. I kind of messed that up, but you get the idea. So if I practice electric guitar soloing solidly for about a week, I would really be on top of my game. But as I mentioned, I've been putting most of my emphasis on classical and accompanying a vocalist, and I really haven't even touched my electric guitar in quite a while. So the other thing I would concentrate heavily on early on, if somebody was in that type of position of learning, is arpeggios. And of course, I would recommend using a metronome. I would recommend learning all the arpeggios in each particular hand position. Of course, our basic C major scale here would, of course, be duplicated up and down the fingerboard, advising the student to learn everything that I would teach them in one position to apply it to all other keys as well. So somebody would hopefully learn all keys simultaneously and not just be limited to their A minor or their D minor or E minor, as a lot of people are in the early stages. I would also recommend learning the harmonic minor scale. There are a lot of very interesting melodies that can be found within the harmonic minor scale, and of course it's in very popular use in a lot of hard rock, and it's been in use for, of course, many years, dating all the way back to guys like Paganini and Bach and so forth. As far as other types of techniques, I would recommend going vertically up and down one string in one scale with things like and doing that on each string. So that the student then becomes comfortable moving either vertically or horizontally, or a combination. Maybe you might start out horizontally. And combine horizontal and vertical motions, things like that. So I think you get the idea. There are definitely a lot of things I could teach an aspiring lead guitarist who wants to play in a band of various sorts, be it hard rock, metal, whatever it might be. And I hope that is sufficient to be interesting. And again, if I was to drill myself on these kind of techniques for a few days at a time, I would probably regain my smoothness that I once had as a solo lead guitarist. This is Prelude in C minor by Augustin Barrios. to provide a little material for you in the classical realm. I already recorded some songs on my steel string. I actually used my steel string the vast majority of the time, even for classical. I just like the sound of it going through some reverb and some chorus for even the classical songs. But I do have a couple of bona fide classical guitars as well. So I thought I'd give you something here that is on the more traditional classical guitar with a classical guitar sound. This is Romanza, the traditional and popular Spanish song with just a couple of verses of it, with a little intro I put together myself.